to you, Dr. Vivek.
Hey, hi everyone. Thank you for inviting me. It's really good to be here. Special thanks to Varghese for his patience as we, found the time to do this. And yeah, I'm really excited to be here. And hi. Okay. So I'm going to offer some notes today on the ways in which performance theory can help us think about caste in everyday life.
I am able to ask this question because I think I have read your work before. For the others, it's a lot to take in.
Who is that?
Please continue, Vivek.
Sorry, I thought there was.
No, there was someone who switched on the mic. It doesn't matter. Please continue.
Okay, no worries. I'll just take two. It'll be good to a lot of what I'm talking about is performance and so on. It'll be good to see some faces if at all possible. So it'll be good to. Thank you, Varghese. Thank you. Yeah. Okay, so I want to offer some notes today on the ways in which performance theory can help us think about caste in everyday life. Performance will allow us to pay attention to presence, embodiment, action, and interaction in describing the social life of caste and the practice of anti-caste politics. I use performance here and throughout my talk today to mean repetitive action or learned behavior, which goes beyond aesthetic forms to include all kinds of social behavior. So performance refers not only to Kathakali and Qawwali, for example, but also to social behaviors such as going to the theater or concerts, and more generally to our ways of presenting ourselves and interacting with others in everyday life. In this broad sense, performance becomes a kind of analytical lens through which to view society, paying attention to the ways in which repetitive action makes social interaction. I'll organize my notes today in three sections. I'll begin by describing Iyengar's Villuvandi Samaram and offer an overview of my argument, after which I'll look closely at the caste codes of 19th century Travancore, and conclude with some remarks on the relationship between transgression and modernity. So this should be well below 50, the happy problem of finishing early, I think. So I should end in about 40 minutes. So hopefully that will give us more time for discussion and comments and so on. Okay. A political protest by Iyengar in 1893, known as the Villuvandi Samaram, or the Bullock Cart protest, offers a keyhole through which to view the ordinary experience of caste in 19th century Travancore. Caste-based rules or norms, known as Jati Maryada, governed all aspects of social behavior, including the right of way, the right to wear clean white clothes, and the right to ride a Villuvandi or a Bullock Cart. So in 1893, when Iyengar, a young man belonging to the Dalit community of Pulayas, dressed in white clothes and matching turban and rode a Villuvandi into a crowded marketplace in Thiruvananthapuram, he violated all aspects of Jati Maryada. I quote from THP Chandarisheri's authoritative oral historical account. Quote, the Savarna decrees had it that the Avarnas could not enter public streets. Iyengar challenged those codes by purchasing a Villuvandi or Bullock Cart. On the necks of two white bulls, he hung two loud brass bells. He was clad in a white half-sleeve banyan and a white upper cloth wrapped around his head. Those clothes were the biggest violation of Jati Maryada. The Villuvandi galloped along the forbidden public streets. The bulls clamored with their bells and hooves. The Savarna Brahmanis, who could not tolerate the sight, drew close with murderous weapons. It was only then that the cart slowed down a little. Hey, you! How dare you wear an upper cloth? A roar. Unfazed by that roar, Iyengar drew the dagger tucked at his waist. Unquote. We know from Chandarisheri's retelling that Iyengar's transgressive action met with Savarna violence. Thinking of this political action simply as transgression may explain Savarna outrage, but it will not help us grasp its significance to the long history of anti-caste struggle in Kerala. I propose that we theorize Iyengar's Villuvandi Samaram as a political action played out against the backdrop of caste codes. That is, by conceptualizing caste as performance. for caste shapes embodiment, choreographs movement, and establishes notions of linguistic propriety and social etiquette through codes of conduct that govern behavior by regulating everyday practices and rehearsing modes of self-presentation. These performative codes of conduct seek to order interaction in ways that make caste legible and ultimately governable. Caste codes are reiterative citational practices whose identifications of castes produce, in effect, their social existence. Iyengar's Villuvandi Samaram shows that transgressing these caste codes through forbidden behavior can initiate a struggle for change, even, as I will try to show today, for equality. Yet, caste is not, after all, simply a matter of prescriptive code and social behavior. Iyengar's Villuvandi Samaram would not have been possible, to state the obvious, without the bullock cart. Owning a Villuvandi meant that one could buy wood, direct human labor, and own animals. The material presence of the cart lies at the center of this event that performatively claimed and reconstituted public space that caste-based codes of conduct denied the oppressed castes. Similarly, Iyengar's spotless white clothes and turban defied codes that prescribed what material may adorn a Pulaya body. As with the Villuvandi, here too, materiality interacts with code and behavior in overdetermined ways. Looking at caste through the lens of performance must keep in view the non-human aspects of caste, the world of things and institutions. The materiality of things and institutions embodies and encasts social behaviors, attempting to align them with or resist performative codes of conduct. To grasp the historical significance of Iyengar's Villuvandi Samaram, or bullock cart protest of 1893, we need to pay attention to the interaction between caste codes, the materiality of things and institutions, and social behavior. This triangulation of code, material, and behavior I call Caste Scripts. Caste scripts govern particular modes of self-presentation by dictating conduct, defining access to particular things, and mandating forms of social behavior. They are interactive in that their purview extends beyond the three discrete aspects I identified, code, material, and behavior, into the heterogeneous realms that lie between them. These scripts are also always relational in that castes, as B.R. Ambedkar points out, exist only in the plural number. Their relationality is a constant reminder that, quote, there is no such thing as a caste. There are always castes, unquote. That is, caste scripts not only characterize particular modes of self-presentation, but also govern encasted social interaction. By encasting, encasted, etc., a word that you'll probably hear a lot today, I refer to repetitive enactments that blur the boundaries between code, material, and behavior to assign certain values and attributes. The performative process of encasting puts caste scripts into play. In this sense, it's impossible to consider one without the other, right? So that's what I mean by encasting. Caste scripts map to social meaning and exist in a creative relationship with the grammar of caste codes. If caste scripts enabled us to conceptualize the performative process of encasting in everyday life, it is because they are weighted in favor of social meaning, even as they remain tethered to grammatical rules. Caste scripts constitute particular definitions in everyday life of what makes a human life. They provide a language within which struggles over what it means to be human are conceived, disputed, negotiated, and fought. They offer, in short, a language within which to contend who is and is not considered to be human. Thus, the purview of caste scripts extends far beyond merely prescribing how one might appear and what things one could use and how one should behave. They offer nothing less than meaning in an encasted form of life. Therefore, caste scripts are almost always fiercely contested. The friction resulting from the contentious performance of caste scripts within particular forms of life gives it the potential both to assert and oppose caste. Iyengar's bullock cart bears two conflicting caste scripts, one asserting domination and the other performing resistance. The Nair landlord riding the Villuvandi was a master surveying his subjects, whereas Iyengar rehearsing the same behavior was a rebel against caste. The first caste script performs domination through repetitive behavior, whereas the second enacts anti-caste resistance through political action. These conflicting caste scripts are braids to enact political claims on public space, on embodiment, and ultimately on equality. The Villuvanti Samaram attested to the emergence of egalitarian discourses and concomitant genealogies of the human in Kerala, which burst open the closed world of subjection circumscribed by Jati Maryada. Fully grasping the significance of Ayangali's intervention and appreciating the magnitude of the genealogies of the human require taking a closer look at the caste codes of colonial Kerala. These caste codes were comprehensive and governed social interactions in the domains of space, body, and language. They spatialized hierarchy by mandating distances between castes, made caste legible through prescribed modes of embodiment, and enforced certain linguistic proprieties. Taken together, these three domains of caste codes governed modes of self-presentation and ordered interaction. As with caste everywhere, the Jati Maryada of colonial Kerala rewarded those who followed its codes and brought down harsh punishment on those who dared to challenge it. The remit of caste codes, however, went beyond governing discrete aspects such as space, body, and language to cohering acceptable forms of personhood that range from abjection to reverence. The significance of Ayangali's political actions lie not only in their contestation and refusal of the caste codes of Jati Maryada, but also in performing new caste scripts exemplifying a modern individual, forming collectives to struggle towards a new egalitarian society. In the aftermath of the Villuvanti Samaram, Ayangali emerged as a leader of the former enslaved Dalit communities and led more broad-based agitations against caste elsewhere across Travancore. Well into the 21st century, he continues to be the most widely recognized icon of the contemporary Dalit movement in Kerala. To this day, the Villuvanti Samaram continues to inspire reenactments in Kerala in contexts ranging from Dalit women demanding entry to the Sabrimala temple in 2018 to Dalits agitating for right-of-way in 2021, to name only two examples. Ayangali's transgressions of caste codes, beginning with the Villuvanti Samaram, offered new forms of personhood embodying self-respect that drew upon discourses of equality to perform new caste scripts challenging the caste order of abjection and reverence. In transforming self and society, these transgressive anti-caste actions ushered in political modernity to Kerala. The significance of Ayangali's Villuvanti Samaram was not merely transgressing caste codes, but enacting new caste scripts that embodied a modern person and presented a vision of an egalitarian society. By conceptualizing caste as performance, I will argue today that Ayangali's Villuvanti Samaram was not merely a protest, but rather a harbinger of political modernity. The performance framework of caste I theorize here accommodates both the modes of self-presentation that assert caste and political actions that perform anti-caste resistance. This framework will also allow us to look beyond these specific mandates to the encasted forms of personhood that emerge through everyday performance. But what were these mandates of Jati Maryada? So in the second section, I'll talk a little more about the Jati Maryadas and get into detail. Okay. The caste codes of colonial Kerala mandated encasted self-presentation and governed interaction in the domains of space, body, and language. The spatial codes were especially remarkable for their intricate relational choreographies that not only decreed access and controlled mobility, but also directed proxemic relationships, distance between people. Furthermore, these codes included prescriptions regarding embodiment, posture, clothes, hairstyles, and jewelry. Finally, language, understood as situated linguistic practices rather than as discrete codes, also fell under the purview of Jati Maryada, particularly by encasting self-referential terms that defined modes of self-presentation and forms of address that governed interaction. Analyzing the codes of Jati Maryada within a performance framework allows me, first, to reconceptualize caste-mandated distances as spatial codes that choreographed abjection and reverence. Second, to rethink signifying objects representing a graded hierarchy as performative encasted things conscripting bodies. And third, to reframe caste-prescribed language customs as linguistic codes of self-presentation that co-constitute the social order through everyday performance. I'll treat each of these in turn. These caste codes were also always gendered practices, since maintaining caste purity depends upon policing women's sexuality. Given that endogamy is the only characteristic that is peculiar to caste, Ambedkar's words, preventing miscegenation through patriarchal regulation of women's sexuality is central to maintaining the caste order. Caste codes must therefore be understood intersectionally, for their regulations were compounded by and inseparable from patriarchal norms in each domain. These caste codes encompassed and arrayed all across caste, across gender, in a hierarchical order. They performed within and across the domains of space, body, and language, what Ambedkar calls the ascending scale of reverence and a descending scale of contempt. The hegemony of caste codes was enforced through violence. Numerous ethnographic and historical sources indicate that anyone found in violation of Jati Maryada could be killed by a caste superior. Such binding of terror and performance is, as Rustam Barucha points out, reiterative and citational. The violent enactment of these performative codes of conduct, codes of caste, constituted the encasted society of colonial era Kerala. If caste is performatively constituted through these reiterative embodied practices spanning the domains of space, body, and language, then Iyengar's intervention constituted both an insurrection against the caste order and an assertion of the modern human. Space. The history of colonial Kerala is, in a sense, the history of access to public spaces such as roads, schools, courts of law, and places of worship. Insurrectionary and reformist movements before and after Iyengar's Villuvandi Samaram lay claims to public space in direct contravention of Jati Maryada. And I'm thinking, some of you may know the Chandar Lahala of the early and mid 19th century, Narayana Guru's temple consecration at Arivipur in 1888, or much later, the Vaikam Satyagraha of 1924. So really movements across a range of insurrectionary and reformist sort of agendas, but all laying claim to public space. So in that sense, the Villuvandi Samaram was not unique. It was part of a generalized movement against these Jati Maryadas governing spatial codes. Okay. If spatial codes put these spaces beyond the reach of the untouchable slave castes, they also simultaneously identified those who were denied access as untouchable. This was, in other words, a co-constitutive process that marked both space and bodies. Moreover, reserving access to spaces such as roads, schools, and temples facilitated Savarna appropriation of commons. Seen in this context, Iyengar's Villuvandi Samaram can be readily understood as a transgressive political action that enacted anti-caste resistance. So you can see that clearly. But this was not all. For strict and absolute, though these spatial caste codes were, they were not unique to Kerala. They continue in many parts of India today, right? So that's not what was unique about Kerala's spatial codes. What was unique to Kerala was the complex choreographies scored by the relational codes that governed proxemic relations. This phenomenon, known as distance pollution in missionary ethnographies and scholarly literature, is understood to have choreographed proxemic relations between various castes and thereby spatialized the caste order. When viewed through the lens of performance, however, these spatial codes of Jati Maryada reveal more than what prevailing theories of distance pollution can accommodate. These spatial codes were organized under three broad categories: untouchability, unapproachability, and unseeability. A Nair could, for instance, approach but not touch a Nambudiri. Between them existed a relationship of untouchability. These norms regarding pollution imposed varying distances of unapproachability across castes. An Eedava or Tiya must keep 36 feet from a Nambudiri and 12 feet from a Nair. Pulayas, who were considered unseeable by the Nambudiris, had to maintain a distance of at least 96 feet from the Nambudiris. The practice was so well established that the distances mandated by Jati Maryada between castes became, in popular parlance, units of spatial measurement. A Tiyapad referred to 36 feet, the distance between a Tiya or an Eedava and a Nambudiri, while a Cherumapad referred to 64 feet, the distance between a Cheruma and a Nair. So these were widely recognized and understood codes. But how were these distances maintained when all parties were on the move? The anthropologist Joan Mencher points out that these prescribed distances corresponded to the standard architectural features, such as the distance from the doorway of a Nambudiri home or an illam to the main gate, to the courtyard, or to the first step of the veranda. While this distance could be precisely imposed within the home, since they were architecturally sort of marked, on open grounds or public roads, they had to be roughly assessed by sight. Thus, the typical distance from the illam to the main gate, 96 feet, was applied between two extreme ends of the caste order, Nambudiris and Pulayas. This distance became roughly equated to unseeability. The other mandated distances were calculated in similar fashion through rough assessment. These spatial codes were, in other words, highly uncertain. So all this is based on Joan Mencher's argument, what I just said about the architectural features. Uncertain though they were, violating these norms attracted extreme punishment, even death. The combination of uncertain codes and extreme punishment in the spatial codes gave precarious terror to tyrannical power. The proper observance of these codes meant willing participation, which was rewarded rather poorly, whereas any aberration was punished severely. Therefore, the slave castes were obliged not only to follow these choreographic prompts, but also to appear to be willingly adhering to the caste codes by abjecting and debasing themselves. For the upper castes were on the watch for any transgression. Anyone who appeared not to be subjecting themselves to these caste codes, who dared to presume to be a fellow human, who dared to act with self-respect and autonomy, was to be cut down like an animal. Quotes. Numerous ethnographies use the exact same words, actually. Probably a translation from the Malayalam of, Vetti. So in other words, the spatial codes of Jati Maryada effected much more than what the concept of distance pollution accommodates. They not only spatially positioned the slave castes, but also mandated performances of abjection and humility. Anything less was seen as a violation of Jati Maryada, for the object of spatial codes was never merely distance, but an abjected form of personhood. These spatial caste codes provided choreographic prompts that went beyond governing space to regulating encasted modes of self-presentation. I'm saying that spatial codes were not merely measures of distance, but rather were scores for performance. Oh, sorry, we just lost power here for a second. I'll just plow on. You can hear me, right, Varghese? Okay, yeah.
Yes, yes, we can hear. Yes.
Yeah, we can hear you.
It'll come back in a second.
Yeah, sure.
Sorry. Yeah. Anyway, I was saying that spatial codes are not merely measures of distance, but rather scores for performance. This relational choreography is therefore central to understanding the performative constitution of caste. This distinctive feature of Kerala's caste order has been understood thus far as either curiosity or survival, as odd expressions of caste. However, in a performance-centric view, spatial codes become an essential scripts that govern behavior and may be considered a form of caste choreography. In this view, Ayangali's appearance reimagined caste scripts of abjection choreographed by spatial Jati Maryada to embody a new self-respecting modern individual. Caste codes configured bodies in space. In order to do this effectively, caste had to be made legible from a distance through embodied codes. So now moving on to the body. In Chandarisheri's vivid recreation of the Villuvendi Samaram, he imagines a Savarna man outraged that Ayangali had dared to wear an upper cloth. Humiliating practices such as not being allowed to wear upper body clothes serve the purposes of easily visible identification necessary to maintain the codified distance. In other words, the embodied codes of Jati Maryada made caste legible and enabled encasted emplacement. In colonial Kerala, Bodies were encasted through things such as clothing, accessories, hair and makeup, and jewelry. Anyone familiar with missionary ethnographies will know that the kudumi or the kuduma was a subject of great fascination, and sort of tremendous just records, chapters and chapters devoted to it. These caste marked bodies enacted caste scripts that were born of the interaction among performative caste codes of Jati Maryada, the materiality of encasted things, and everyday social behavior. So again, they were part of that same complex. The materials that encasted bodies became assertive and agential entities through social performance. These encasted things constituted entangled relationships between the human and the non-human, exhibiting the kind of agency that Martin Heidegger identified as the hallmark of a thing as opposed to an object. A thing, in Robin Bernstein's words, invites us to dance. These encasted things not only made caste legible and identifiable for the purpose of maintaining the codified distance, but also performed insignia that arrayed human bodies on a graded scale from abjection to reverence. Understanding the everyday performance of reverence and abjection enacted by the dance of encasted things and caste-marked bodies is necessary to grasp the significance of Ayengali's violation of the Jati Maryada for slave caste and appropriation of Nair costume. Okay, I will not describe in the interest of time these very elaborate codes, but all I'll say for now is that these codes applied to every caste and were easily recognizable. There was a consensus. Again, it was enforced through violence, of course. So from the most revered to the most abject, these codes of embodiment did not merely mark bodies to make caste legible, but interacted with bodies to encast modes of presentation. As with spatial choreography earlier, here too, bodies were governed through posture and comportment once their caste was made legible. For instance, when approaching a Nambudiri, a Nair had to stand slightly bent with his right hand covering his mouth, a gesture called, a posture called Ochanam. Some of you are familiar with Malayalam may know this. Channars and other intermediate castes had to bend even further when addressing Nairs, and were of course forbidden from addressing Nambudiris. For the slave caste, the sight of a Nambudiri's palm leaf umbrella in the distance meant having to leave the road and hide in the fields. Be it the Nambudiri's palm leaf umbrella or the Nair woman's achipudava, a particular kind of wearing the particular kind of sari, or the Puliya woman's kallumala or a villuvandi, encasted things further conscripted human bodies and entangled them in the relational choreography of caste in colonial Kerala. They caste-marked bodies in order to array them in a graded hierarchy. Embodiment, spanning caste-marked human bodies and encasted non-human things, became another domain in which caste codes governed encasted forms of personhood and social interaction in colonial Kerala. Ayengali's white clothes and villuvandi bore testimony to the ways in which caste scripts encasted bodies through the interaction, code, material, and behavior. Language. These spatial and embodied codes played directly into linguistic caste codes that formed a third domain within which Jati Maryada governed, a third domain that Jati Maryada governed, adding speech to choreography and embodiment. In Chandarisheri's description of the Villuvandi Samaram, the outraged Savarna man screams, "Hey you, how dare you wear an upper cloth?" In the original Malayalam, he merely says, "Eda melmundu." Melmundu means the upper cloth. So the Eda, Malayalam word Eda, is a masculine second person pronoun used to address a social inferior. This was only one of the many ways in which language was codified to govern encasted social interaction. Speech extended in language the spatial choreography of encasted bodies in 19th century Kerala. All castes, from Savarnas to the slave castes, shouted particular phrases to announce their presence as they walked, so that they would not violate the spatial codes of Jati Maryada. Savarnas such as Nambudiris and Nayars shouted ho ho to announce their arrival, whereas Ijavas shouted Tindale, and the slave castes were forced to shout Ijokida. These linguistic practices gave voice to social actors in the hierarchical role play of reverence and contempt that characterizes caste. The caste codes that govern linguistic practices and associated modes of self-presentation are known as Acharya Bhasha, or language customs. The dominant theoretical approach in studies of Acharya Bhasha is to point to the linguistic stylization by caste and argue for a reflectionist approach. In this view, if society is unequal, then language would quite naturally reflect these inequalities. Here, social bonds and power structures exist prior to and somewhat independent of language. In contrast to this reflectionist perspective, I adopt a Goffmanian approach, thinking of Wim Goffman's presentation of self in everyday society when I say this. So in contrast to this reflectionist perspective, I adopt a Goffmanian approach in which language forms but one critical aspect of social performance. Here, linguistic formations and social power structures are co-constitutive, and the one maps onto the other. For those of you with interest in linguistic anthropology, I'm thinking especially of language ideologies and Asif Agha's formulation of enregisterment. So for these relationships between language and power. This relational role play meant that social actors often adopted different parts. For example, a Nair spoke differently to a Nambudiri and to a Pulaya. His voice is enregistered as a slave when addressing the Nambudiri and as a master when addressing the Pulaya. All three players are already choreographed spatially, and their bodies are encasted in various ways through proxemics, posture, bearing, dress, accoutrements, and gestural vocabularies. Language forms, therefore, the third key component in the performative constitution of caste. The enregisterment enacted by the language ideology of Acharya Bhasha contributed another significant aspect to the caste scripts of colonial Kerala. Acharya Bhasha is distinguished by the graded hierarchy that stretches between respect and humility. The aggrandizing effects of words indicating reverence, Adara Sujaka Padam, and the belittling effect of words indicating humility, or Vinaya Sujaka Padam, is the basic principle upon which the language ideology of Acharya Bhasha is organized. This spectrum between self-aggrandizement or reverence and self-effacement or humility constitutes another caste script that extends to all aspects of communicative practices and refers to people, so nouns, pronouns, forms of address, etc., things, so nouns, and everyday practices, verbs. This relational spectrum is referred to in everyday parlance through its endpoints. Ucha Bhasha, or the higher language, refers to the language an inferior adopts to their superior, whereas Nicha Bhasha, or the lower language, refers to a superior addressing their inferior. And this, included, like I said, goes to how people refer to their homes, how people refer to how they slept, how they had a bath. All those terms were coded across castes, right? It's really fascinating detail that I wish we could go into, but I won't in the interest of finishing sometime today. So language encasts human bodies within particular modes of self-presentation that personify the graded hierarchies of Ucha Bhasha and Nicha Bhasha. These encasted modes of self-presentation are not merely outcroppings of an already existing entity or the expressive manifestations of caste that existed somehow out there. Rather, Acharya Bhasha was one critical aspect of the performative codes of Jati Maryada that defined a closed world of subjection in colonial Kerala. Okay, now moving on to my concluding section. The object of Jati Maryada was, in short, always more than the particular domain it governed, be it space, body, or language. Jati Maryada mandated performances of encasted forms of personhood and hierarchically graded them on a scale that ranged from abjection to reverence. In doing so, Jati Maryada constituted a governing theology as grammar, making caste legible, ordering interaction, maintaining graded inequality, and enforcing subjection. Such were the moral certitudes of the old world of Jati Maryada that the concept of equality broke open. If the encasted forms of personhood within this close world of subjection range from abjection to reverence, then discourses of equality and the concomitant notion of the human opened up new horizons within which these certitudes were interrogated, challenged, and fundamentally reimagined. I'm echoing Sanal Mohan here in all his work, but especially Modernity of Slavery. but really in all his essays and works beyond that book as well. Ayangali's Villuvendi Samaram was more than merely an appropriation of Savarna appearance or transgression of caste codes, for it enacted claims to equality that reimagined conceptions of life and what it meant to be human. In the collision between egalitarian notions and Jati Maryada, Ayangali's action interrogated and challenged these codes in the domains of space, body, and language, while embodying a new modern individual demanding respect in a modern society that was, at least in principle, egalitarian. It made available, in short, new forms of personhood based on what we have come to recognize as modern values: respect, autonomy, inwardness, the sense of self-possession. The significance of Ayangali's Villuvendi Samaram, coming as it did in the wake of the genealogies of the human that brought the concept of equality and concomitant notions of human to colonial Kerala, lies in fundamentally calling into question the closed world of subjection circumscribed by Jati Maryada. In caste-bound colonial Kerala, to be modern was to transgress the dehumanizing codes of Jati Maryada. By to be modern, I refer to a self-conscious attempt to break from the past and claim to be new, and above all, to seek the values of equality, individual autonomy or selfhood, and respect. In colonial Kerala, radical claims to modernity asserted that to be human means to struggle for these rights, or, as Sanal Mohan says, quote, for Dalits, equality was modernity, unquote. In the world of Ayangali's Villuvendi Samaram, the explosively unstable concept of equality and other attendant universals, such as autonomy and respect, brought a new consciousness that could and did call into question the closed loop of subjection. With the growing acceptance of these concepts associated with political modernity, agency could now include a Puleya making a daring claim to play the part of an Iyer, to be, in fact, an equal. In doing so, this transgressive act introduced the figure of a modern individual whose emancipatory methods were insurrectionary. Ayangali's insurrectionary political action performed a claim to, in Hannah Arendt's influential formulation, the right to have rights. Transgressing the codes of subjection was integral to the assertion of common humanity. To have the right to have rights, one had to stop acting as a slave of the caste order. This was, as Ambedkar noted in the context of untouchable subjection in 18th century Maharashtra, a necessary preliminary en route to political subjecthood. To conclude then, I argued today that understanding Ayangali's Villuvendi Samaram requires situating it within the world of Jati Maryada in colonial Kerala and recognizing that the explosive indeterminacy of the concept of equality split open that closed world of subjection. The performance framework I propose today accommodates both conceptions of the caste itself, governed by caste codes, and the significance of political actions making claims to equality. In enacting a defiant new beginning against the performance codes of the old caste order, Ayangali's transgressive actions offered a new vision of a new form of personhood and an articulation, or at the very least, a hope of new freedom. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Vivek, for the very provocative reflections and lecture. Well, I mean, of course, you have given a very broad spectrum of anti-caste movement in Kerala. And Ayangkali was one of the major figure, but somehow he is neglected in our academic writings. Good that you have brought out his whole story. I mean, in your lecture, I mean, I think what you try to do is tell us the interplay between caste codes, caste materiality, and caste behavior. And I mean, it's very beautifully you have actually brought out this tension between this through three, and how they were actually reimagined and reworked during the colonial period. So I think without any delay, we will open up this for discussion. But before that, I think I can start with something. Say, I mean, say, there is an attempt to climb a new public space and demand the political right, and of course equality, as you brought out in this lecture. But I mean, so, of course, all these were coming as a kind of response to, again, colonial modernity, right? But what is that triggering point, or say the foundation for the new imagination? Okay, say Iyengar's new imagination, like this Villuvandi, what you call Samaram. I mean, using bullock cart, wearing white clothes, climbing new positions. So there should be some foundation. Like I can tell you something from Hyderabad experience. There was a Bhagya Verma Bolke, a similar kind of personality. And he claims that the Dalits were ruler, so they call themselves as Maharajas, and they actually use the Sudra upper caste Reddy's titles as their name suffixes, and he actually change his name as Serma. I mean, so uses these titles Serma, Reddy as a suffix to his name. And this all, I mean, new imagination basically, of course, a response to the modernization process, but there is a inherent some kind of foundation and base for their climb. So what was that in Iyengar's case? I mean, what was that actually is basing on which he's making the climbs? Now, say for example, wearing white clothes and traveling by cart. So what is that base? Can you just explain a little bit?
Yeah, thank you. That's a great question. And in some ways, what I heard was you asking where these egalitarian notions, where these sort of empowering sense of the modern individual and so on, how was it emerging basically in Kerala? And this is really a fascinating sort of subject in some ways, because exactly like you said, in relation to colonial modernity and in the turmoil that sort of happened, so in the talk today, I referred to the genealogies of the human a few times, and what I mean by that is rooted in these notions that we've come to recognize as modern values, inwardness, egalitarianism, autonomy, self-respect, etc. And the ways in which those values mapped onto this figure of the human, right? This sort of invention of the figure of the human. And if we look at the roots through which those ideas sort of emerge, certainly the missionaries play a massive catalyzing sort of role, right? And there are any number of records that sort of attest to this. Others who have written about this in the context of Maharashtra, obviously Rosalind O'Hanlon sort of leaps to mind, a book that's now nearly 40 years old. I think it came out in the mid 80s. So on Phule. But more recently in Kerala, of course, Anil Mohan writes about this, talking about the ways in which these discourses, missionary discourses specifically, contributed to an emergence of even a narration and crying, like crying about my sins and I repent and I want to be a new person who's saved by the Lord. But that idea is rooted in being able to redeem oneself, which meant a certain autonomous individual capable of transformation, right? The Komarovs talked about this in the context of Southern Africa, and of course they influenced Sanal Mohan considerably, right? So, so certainly the missionaries were one route for that. But that also sort of, again, I keep referring to this sort of indeterminacy or explosive nature of equality. There's no way to contain it once it's, cat's out of the bag kind of situation, right? So you had at the same time, Narayana Guru, for example, using some of these similar ideas to talk about Advaita and sort of repurposing that to articulate a certain anti-caste kind of, doctrine, right? You also had, even before Narayana Guru, you had, like Ayya Vaikundar, for example, right? Who drew significantly from both missionaries. His sort of myth of himself as the son of God had very curious and interesting sort of overlaps with, the Christ myth, that he went to bathe in the sea and he was lost for 3 days and then he came back. And so it's a religion that continues to this day, called the Ayyavadi, as many of you know. And that had significant overlaps with Shaiva Siddhanta kind of doctrine and so on. So these are all doctrines that were in the air, so to speak. They were all part of that backdrop against which Iyengali. So Iyengali by no means was some kind of autochthonous figure, absolutely not. But that's what makes it, I think, that much more interesting, because there was such an interplay, drawing from quite disparate, many of them religious sources, right? Religion not as not in a theological sense alone, but as a kind of moral source. I'm thinking of Charles Taylor here when I say this, religion as a way to empower human beings to take some kind of action, right? I mean, the religion's other part we could see very well in the Jati Maryada already, so I won't belabor that point. But the ways in which missionary and Narayana Guru and Ayya Vaikundar and Ayya Vadi and so on also provided religion as a kind of moral source that people drew from, people like Iyengali, right? And Iyengali's followers, some were Christian, some were Hindu.
Vivek, what you're explaining is something about agency. So my claim is a slightly different. I mean, the base for their claim.
Right.
Yeah.
So
I mean, like they say Raja Ram Mohan, right? What is the base for Raja Ram Mohan? It's a Vedas. I mean, so whatever is it's not said in Vedas,
right.
opposing. So something like that. Is there something in Kerala's case?
So so I don't locate that in one textual corpus. In fact, I don't locate it in a textual corpus at all. I locate it in a set of everyday, some of them religious, but a set of everyday practices. So that's why I explain those three routes, which had, some of them had theological sort of texts, right? I mean, Ayya Vadi had, of course, Narayana Guru had a vast corpus of scriptural material, but the ways in which they practiced those things in their everyday act of worship was also an important aspect. So, I mean, that's my methodological sort of efforts to go beyond that textual corpus, in fact.
Okay. Yeah, okay, right, thank you. So, participants can directly ask questions to...
I see some...
This Aloka has raised her hands.
Yeah, Aloka ma'am, please, Pranay, can you unmute all the participants for a while? Pranay, are you there? Yeah, please unmute.
Yeah, okay. Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, we were all muted, so we have to raise our hands rather than speak, right? Yeah. Going with the tenor of what Vivek has spoken, right?
Yeah.
Not allowed.
I know, right? Yeah.
Sorry. Speech controlled by digital thing.
Yeah.
I want to sort of extend in some ways what Professor Bangya has raised. but I also want to locate it in the context of the tenor of your presentation, because I think that you're concerned about the everydayness of the performative acts, right? So instead of looking for spiritual authority as a kind of agency, again, from the Telangana and Andhra areas, there are very rich traditions of caste genealogies, especially of the lower castes, which counter their origin I mean, the contest actually, their origin from, whatever is the Brahmanical perspective. And these are some very powerful narratives that get articulated in performances, literal performances, that is, and that these are there in the everyday lives of people. So I'm not familiar too much with the Kerala situation, but I was just wondering whether one, there is a caste or community or profession of genealogists. And even if there isn't, like in Andhra Pradesh, you have the Runjas, right? It's a particular category and they go from village to village and so on. But then also Dipankar Gupta is also for Northern India, Western India and all that. He has also narrated many oral testimonies, especially during the so-called colonial period, which have been recorded and put down in all these, missionary records and all that, that these people have their own perspective of how they came about to be and all that. And therefore, there is a very long, and of course I work on very old periods of Indian history, so I'm just trying to make myself relevant for just before the modern, just before the modern, that there would be very strong, deep traditions of contesting. But these contestations would not be the way we look at modern contestations. So, I mean, I think that your argument is absolutely on the mark as far as how ideas of egalitarianism, the missionary efforts, etc., happen. But then I think that everyday practices are rooted in much more deeper, non-modern spaces.
Sure.
Pre-modern spaces. So how much ever there is this whole thing about bringing ideas of equality and all that, but the rootedness is still, and I'm reminded of Michael Adas and people like that who talk about, this everyday Douglas Haynes and people like that, who in the colonial context, of course, there's a problem there because they're looking at merchants of Surat also having an agency, even though they are quite an elite group. But so the tenor of my question is that cannot we draw upon these narratives of castes which are not so well treated within the traditional hierarchical? Because when you were saying, when you were speaking, I was just thinking, my God, whatever he's describing is a replication of a Brahmanical Dharma Shastra, 20 feet away, and then doing this, that. This is like all narrated in the Smriti and Shastra traditions. So were the upper caste Keralites actually following these to the line? I mean, it's like almost literally sounding like that.
No, the distance pollution was not, it had some sort of scriptural sources for sure, but it was enforced in everyday practice. So, was there some kind of, contestation within? What I'm talking about is the contestation. That's exactly what I'm talking about. So the other part of what you said, right, these sort of rich repertoires of, forms of oral history, genealogies, and so on, they exist in Kerala as well. And I'm also thinking of Shail Mayuram's work, for example, on talking about that kind of. One reason that, what I'm really interested in is in looking at that moment of turmoil during colonial modernity. So I don't, I literally start in 1806, right? So in a sense, even if I'm, so while I was talking about genealogies of the human just now, the bulk of my work there is focused on religion, unlike what I talked about today, right? Unlike with Iyengali. But religion as understood as a contestatory space that has significant sort of, it's not merely organizational politics, like, so there's a kind of way of reading the flows of those egalitarian ideas within that, right? So Ayyavari is an example, Narayana Guru is another example, and the missionaries. So those were, what I was thinking of earlier. So as for it being pre-modern, in a sense, the focus again is at looking at moments where there were claims specifically articulated that this is something new. Modernity as a claim rather than as a, as a condition, right? So that's my focus. So that's what I'm trying to look at. So in a sense, the pre-modern spaces, of course, and like you pointed out with the genealogists or with other sort of oral histories, they exist and they continue to exist, in fact, right?
Yeah, but I didn't mean chronologically that you're beginning with 1806, but I think that even in 1806 and after, or for that matter, even today, there are pre-modern spaces that people occupy and enact. Right.
Sure.
So the very question of caste oppression is a pre-modern space. But within that pre-modern space, are there any traditional means? So these days, for example, in the case of the Valmikis, for example, or many other caste communities, they're using some of the traditional ways in which to counter their position in society and tracing their genealogy to Valmiki. And when the Ramayana has become, so I'm not talking about, you looking at a pre-modern period. I'm just saying that anyway, I will stop here because there's a lot of questions for you in the chat box and we can continue after.
I want to make one comment though. So I'm looking at caste specifically as a modern phenomenon too. So I'm not looking at it as a, of course it has a significant pre-modern life, but it's not, I don't think of caste as a pre-modern phenomenon. Right. So I think that's a big sort of point of contention.
Okay. Right. Verghese?
Yeah. Thank you, Vivek, for this rich and evocative presentation. And obviously, the lens of performance provides a refreshingly new and expressive language, to the entire question of caste, as we have heard from your presentation. Now, my question is partially related to what Professor Bhangi and Professor Aloka is speaking about, because this political strategy of transgression that Iyengali basically represents, which of course resonate, the argument of Anupama Rao in some ways about confrontational identity and caste radicalism in the context of Maharashtra. But my question is that transgression was one strategy, but at the same time you have referred to Sanal Mohan, where sacrifice, pain, etc. is actually used for community building and were articulated as their claims to emancipation, claims to liberation, right? Now, you have just explained that the roots of this common humanity, which is being politically articulated differently, comes from diverse sources, not only just missionary, but also internal sources like Vaikuntha Samuel, etc. But I'm just wondering why these political strategies were different, right? One is transgressive, the one is internalizing pain and articulating it in public and building a community. Is it also something related to the socio-economic heterogeneity of the Dalit community in Kerala? So that's the first question. And it's also fascinated by your idea of this common humanity, which is being asserted by Iyengali again as a part of the strategy of political emancipation. So I just wanted to know, this is just a curiosity, the evocation of common humanity was, of course, part of this political strategy, but evocation of differences was also part of the political strategy. But in the case of Kerala, was it historically simultaneous or was it later? Right? Yeah.
Sorry, I didn't catch the last part. Can you?
Was it historically simultaneous or is it happened later? Yeah.
Okay, there's a lot to cover here, Varghese. I'll do what I can with the question. So the first part, I'm glad you mentioned Anupama Rao and caste radicalism. In the published version of this paper, it's something that I call upon. I'm very much, I like to think there's a kinship between my argument here and Rao's argument in the caste question. So yeah, I'm glad you sort of heard those resonances. Also, as I cited today, Ambedkar insists on the transgression, of course. That's for Ambedkar, it's a necessary preliminary, right? But on the other hand, there's also, as you pointed out with Sanal Mohan and, even Komarovs and so on, the sense of interiority, repentance, sin, crying, narrating, and so on. Actions that we may not think of as insurrectionary political claims making, but are nevertheless, or at least I'm trying to argue that they do feed into that sort of insurrectionary, moment, right? And the tension between them, I think the tension between them is what I'm trying to bridge with performance as an idea, where performance as a lens that can show us the ways in which we bridge the is and the as if, right? The sense of this is someone and they're acting as if another, ways in which actions add up to a kind of self. Of course, a self that we're inventing always, right? And the way, as I was listening to you and wondering how I would try to do justice to your question, what came to my mind was missionary discourse and the use of the word soul, right? So it repeats constantly in missionary discourse. And at some level within Christian theology, you can just see that in an obvious thing of that which prays and so on. But one of the things I noticed in the records was this shifting meaning between three broad ideas. So one was interiority, right? So that which makes a human at some level. The other was the ability to act, transform, etc., to do things. So what we may think of as agency. And yet another, which I think is something that really, that I'm trying to grapple with, is this sense of becoming what already was. It's a paradoxical claim, so I refer to it as transformative self-possession, which is kind of paradoxical. How are you transforming to possess? That sense. And in all of those, there's this claim to hold that tension together, of being and becoming in some ways. So that's one, and I think it's related to the common humanity. So the second part of your question, right, where the whole concept is rooted in the invention of this common humanity, which was by no means apparent, right? I mean, caste was specifically a denial of that common humanity, right? So it was absolutely, so it was a way of inventing that to say, Sanal Mohan talks about this, where there's a transcript of an interview between two missionaries and, two recently converted slaves. And, they talk about, we see, God came to earth basically as Christ, and he became one of us and so on. The way I understand that is, it's a claim that we too are human, like the Lord. So there's a mirroring going on there, which is rooted in that same invention, of common humanity, as a claim, right? So, so that's one. So in terms of, which was prior, was it the political claims making first or the, repentance? I think you can already see where my answer is going. I suppose I'm, I wouldn't pick it in that sense, right? Because, like take the Chandar Lahala, for example. So 1822 is, when we can definitely see that there was a broad-based agitation against, what I've called today embodied sort of caste codes. but they were also the earliest converts to Christianity. So, which came first? We can only say they are related. I think the specific flow is more difficult to pick, I think, but they're certainly related, I think. But thank you. Yeah, that's a lot to think.
Vivek, there are some 3 questions. So
yeah, I just noticed. Yeah.
Would you like to read, or should I read it out for you?
I can just look at it maybe just for a second. Actually, Lakshmi Devi's question I can quickly answer right away. About the problems with missionary ethnographies.
Yeah.
I suspect even in the question you are alluding to these problems, and what leaps to mind is actually Robin Jeffrey's caveat, which I always think of as quite funny, where he says, because their biases are generally so glaring, they don't come in the way of their usefulness. Of course it was, racist. Of course it was gendered, and it was glaringly so, right?
All the data are constructions. So
right.
Question of having a pure objectivity.
Right. So
anyway, it is out of fashion. So.
Right. No, and why only missionaries? So my other big sources. So one is, as Lakshmi Devi pointed out, missionary ethnographies are a big source for what I'm trying to argue here. The other are the state gazettes, state gazetteers, and so on. So there's this prolific writer that many of you will know, Nagamaya. Ajanta Subramanian also talks about him in Shorelines. He's a source you have to look at if you're looking at early 20th century Travancore. There's no getting around Nagamaya. Now, when you read, his gazettes, he's got this awestruck tone for Nambudris and Nayars, right? There's one point at which he says, apropos of absolutely nothing, he describes the hair knot of Nayar women and then recommends it for practice and adoption in other countries of the world. Completely apropos of nothing, So there's a kind of awestruck way of saying that. And a very objectifying tone when it comes to intermediate castes, slave castes, etc. So it's not, like you said, it's not just missionary ethnographies. This is, the pitfalls of the job.
Can you take up Aditi's?
Yeah, can performative spaces like that? One sec.
Actually, her work is on performance, so she wants to clarify.
Yeah, Aditi, are you here?
Yeah, I think she's here. Aditi?
Yeah, do you want to maybe comment?
Yes, sir, I'm here.
Do you want to say some more?
No, sir, I think I typed out the question.
Okay.
Yes, sir.
It's, I think with performance spaces as well, I think there's the same kind of transgressive potential. There's also just, beyond performance, there's also just the value of representation in public, just seeing, look at Carnatic music, for example, or look at Bharatanatyam, or look at any sort of highly caste-coded performance space, right? Or the Kalamandalam, it's not just, Tamil forms I'm thinking of, right? So I'd see it as part of a sort of larger political sort of struggle, as a larger, within a larger political context, right? Rather than seeing it in isolation. In some ways, that's why I don't have any theater or, any other sort of performing art form in the current project I'm working on, because in some ways I want to bring that to everyday behavior first, and then maybe, because of some of these dangers, because of the danger of seeing, text in isolation, or the danger of seeing a performance space, or, a performing art form in isolation. So, but I'd like to hear more about what specifically you're thinking of and working on.
Yeah, okay. Vivek, can you take up Anandita, our colleague Anandita Mukhopadhyay
Yeah.
question? It's on language issue.
Yeah, brought in language, modern, yeah, language return. I mean, in terms of, thank you, that's a great question. In terms of continuities, everywhere, whenever I say modern, I mean the claim to be new, not the fact of being new. Absolutely not. I'm reminded of Isdasan sir, who commented, I can't remember where, in person or in writing somewhere, where he says, only if we lose the word ni will caste go from Kerala. And ni is the root, it's like tu, right, in Hindi. So it's a root sort of address, and so the continuities are ongoing. They're ongoing, absolutely. So I think, yeah.
Sure.
Yeah, Varghese, I think it is also, Vivek, streamed on YouTube. So is there any questions from YouTube? Varghese, can you check it? Yeah, we can take one or two.
Yeah.
We have still 10 minutes.
I think there is a problem with the muting, but if anyone have a question can raise their hands, then I can quickly unmute them.
Okay. Anybody has any questions?
Let me check it.
Varghese, I see some people in the waiting room. I don't.
Yeah. Can admit them.
No, so far there is no question in the YouTube.
Okay. In that case, I think we'll close it. So, Shamir, are you there? Our PhD scholar.
Waiting room? No.
Yeah, I admitted them. Yes. Just now there was somebody. So
there is no one now. There is no one.
Shamir. Hello, Shamir. Yeah.
Sir, hello.
Yeah. Can you hear us?
Yeah, yes.
Yeah. So now I can request our PhD scholar, Mr. Samir, to propose a formal vote of thanks. Over to you, Samir.
Okay, thank you, sir. Good evening, everyone. On behalf of Department of History, I would like to thank Dr. Vivek Narayan for giving such insightful and informative talk on Iyengali political movements among the Puliya community in Kerala, and also how the Jati Maryada or caste-based code of conduct that govern the social interactions in modern Kerala. And it is very important to understand the Iyengali movement against the Savarna's Jati Maryada and how he restructured the social status of lower caste people and stand for an egalitarian and human status in the modern Kerala. As of now, we have finished 26 webinar series in our department. In this occasion, I would like to thank the faculties in our department who are helping and encouraging the students community to engage with academic space during this pandemic. On behalf of students, I thank the organizers. Also, I thank all the participants who are part of this talk. Thank you so much for turning up your time for the talk. Thank you, everyone.
Okay, thank you, Shamir, to you as well. Okay, and Vivek, thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me. Thank you,
meet up physically at some point.
I hope so. I hope so.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.
We hope to get you to Hyderabad sometime, Vivek.
I would love to do that. I would love to come and see you in person. So thank you so much.
But thank you so much. Great presentation.
Thank you. Thank you.
Really great. Yes.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Okay. Bye. Take care.